Life stories. How one man took down a corrupt HOA president. The shocking truth. When the HOA president tried to evict him, she had no idea. She, Julian Ross, 52, had spent decades building his business from the ground up. After selling his small tech firm, he finally bought his dream home, a stately two-story colonial in Maple Glen Heights, a suburban enclave just outside Boulder, Colorado. The house sat on a corner lot with a wraparound porch and distant views of the Flatirons. It was peaceful, polished, and exactly what Julian envisioned for his next chapter. But something felt off from day one. He had barely begun to unpack when he noticed them. Faces behind curtains, heads turning slightly too slowly, eyes tracking his every move. The silence wasn't quiet, it was intentional. No handshakes, no welcome to the neighborhood, just tightly closed doors and muttered conversations carried on the breeze. He brushed it off. Maybe folks here were just private. Maybe they'd warm up over time. That idea dissolved the next morning. He was sipping his first cup of coffee when a knock rapped sharply on his front door. Standing outside was a tall, silver-haired woman in khaki slacks and a pale blue cardigan. A gold pin on her chest read, "Maple Glen Heights HOA." "Good morning," she said briskly. "I'm Linda Carr, president of the Homeowners Association." Julian smiled, extended a hand. "Julian Ross, just moved in." "I know," she interrupted, glancing past him into the entryway. Then she handed over a thick stack of papers. "These are the community guidelines. I suggest reviewing them thoroughly." Julian skimmed the first few pages. Restrictions on exterior paint colors, rules about lawn length, mailbox dimensions, typical HOA micromanagement. Linda cleared her throat. "We maintain a high standard here," she said, her eyes flicking to the moving truck still parked in his driveway. "That will need to be gone by this evening." "It will be," Julian replied, "once I finish unpacking." She nodded. "And trash bins should never be at the curb before 6 a.m. on collection day. Yours were out last night."
"I didn't put them out. That must have been the previous owners." Linda pursed her lips. "Regardless, please be more mindful. We have rules for a reason." And just like that, she turned and left. Julian shut the door and exhaled. He'd dealt with uptight HOA types before. He wasn't about to let one retiree on a power trip ruin his fresh start. But Linda Carr wasn't just particular, she was watching. The first notice came the next day. An unauthorized vehicle in the driveway. It was Julian's car. Then came a warning about lawn negligence, despite him having just mowed. Then another about excessive porch lighting. Same fixture the last owner had. By the end of the week, Julian had collected 5 letters, neatly folded, each bearing the Maple Glen Heights HOA logo. He hadn't seen Linda since that first meeting, but her presence was everywhere. Still, he played it cool. Maybe this was just how she operated. Maybe if he followed the rules to the letter, she'd back off. That hope faded fast. One evening, Julian walked past a cluster of neighbors chatting by a garage. Their laughter died as he approached. One woman gave him a tight smile. The rest said nothing. In the center stood Linda, arms crossed, eyes locked on him, whispering to the others. Julian didn't need to hear the words. He knew this wasn't about bins or lawns. It was about him. And if Linda Carr thought she could push him out, she was about to meet her match. The next morning brought another letter, this time accusing him of failing to prove ownership of the property. Julian blinked at the paper, then chuckled bitterly. He'd had enough. He spent the weekend photographing other properties. Overgrown grass, bins left out for days, cracked shutters. He cataloged everything, each image time-stamped. Then he sent a formal complaint to the HOA board, copying every member, including the HOA's legal advisor. No response.
"I didn't put them out. That must have been the previous owners." Linda pursed her lips. "Regardless, please be more mindful. We have rules for a reason."
And just like that, she turned and left. Julian shut the door and exhaled. He'd dealt with uptight HOA types before. He wasn't about to let one retiree on a power trip ruin his fresh start. But Linda Carr wasn't just particular. She was watching. The first notice came the next day, an unauthorized vehicle in the driveway. It was Julian's car. Then came a warning about lawn negligence, despite him having just mowed. Then another about excessive porch lighting. Same fixture the last owner, but 2 days later, Linda showed up again, this time with a clipboard and another letter. "We've had ongoing complaints," she said. "We'll need you to submit your deed. There are questions about your occupancy." Julian smiled. "I'm sure there are." He handed her a sealed envelope. "That's my deed, and a letter from my attorney. You'll want to read it carefully." Linda opened it right there. Her face turned white. "You'll find," Julian said calmly, "that any further attempts to harass me will be considered retaliation and legally actionable." She said nothing. "Have a good day," Julian added, closing the door behind him. A week later, Linda Carr resigned from the HOA board. The notices stopped. Neighbors slowly began to wave. Some people think power comes from writing rules, but real power comes from knowing how to enforce the ones that matter and ignore the ones meant to keep people out. Julian stayed, and Maple Glen Heights would never be the same. By the time Julian Ross received the 5th letter in just 2 weeks, he had seen enough to confirm what he already knew. Linda Carr, president of the Maple Glen Heights HOA, was determined to make his life miserable. This latest complaint was about his trash cans. "Bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection to preserve neighborhood aesthetics," the letter read. Julian stared at the paper, irritation bubbling under his skin. He had collected his bins the same way every other resident did, after work. Apparently, that wasn't good enough. Curious, he decided to test a theory. The next morning, Julian rose before dawn, put on a hoodie, and took a slow walk around the cul-de-sac. By 9 a.m., dozens of trash bins still lined the streets. Some weren't even fully closed. Lids popped open with bags spilling out. Not a single violation tag on any of them. By the end of the week, Julian had collected 5 letters, neatly folded, each bearing the Maple Glen Heights HOA logo. He hadn't seen Linda since that first meeting, but her presence was everywhere. Still, he played it cool. Maybe this was just how she operated. Maybe if he followed the rules to the letter, she'd back off. That hope faded fast. One evening, Julian walked past a cluster of neighbors chatting by a garage. Their laughter died as he approached. One woman gave him a tight smile. The rest said nothing. In the center stood Linda, arms crossed, eyes locked on him, whispering to the others. Julian didn't need to hear the words. He knew this wasn't about bins or lawns. It was about him. And if Linda Carr thought she could push him out, she was about to meet her match. The next morning brought another letter, this time accusing him of failing to prove ownership of the property. Julian blinked at the paper, then chuckled bitterly. He'd had enough. He spent the weekend photographing other properties, overgrown grass, bins left out for days, cracked shutters. He cataloged everything, each image time-stamped. Then he sent a formal complaint to the HOA board, copying every member, including the HOA's legal advisor. No response. Just his. Julian snapped a few photos on his phone and composed a polite email to the HOA board. "I noticed consistent non-compliance across the neighborhood. Could you clarify why I alone received a warning?" No response. 2 days later, Linda Carr returned to his doorstep. She didn't knock, just stood there, clipboard in hand, arms crossed, mouth tight. Julian opened the door and leaned against the frame. "Something I can help you with?" Linda didn't speak at first. Instead, her eyes wandered over his shoulder, scanning the entry hall like she was cataloging furniture. Then she held up a form. "This is a formal request for proof of home ownership," she said crisply. Julian's stomach tightened. "Excuse me?" "We've had complaints," she continued, her voice syrupy but sharp. "Neighbors have noted unusual activity. Cars coming and going, furniture deliveries at odd hours. There's concern you may be renting in violation of HOA guidelines." Julian let out a short, dry laugh. "You're kidding." Linda's face didn't flinch. He took a breath and steadied himself. "First, I own this house. Second, I've been here less than a month. That's why there are deliveries. And the cars? Friends and family. I didn't realize social visits violated HOA codes." Linda's lips pressed tighter. Her fingers curled around the clipboard. "We have procedures to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted," she said. "We'll need to verify your deed." Julian had no doubt. She hadn't made this request at anyone else on the block. Still, he kept his tone even. "You're welcome to look it up. It's public record." "I'd prefer you submit it directly," she replied coolly.
"And if I don't?" Her smile stretched, but there was no warmth. "Then I'll escalate the matter to the HOA board." Julian exhaled slowly, biting back the urge to argue. That's what she wanted, to provoke him, to turn him into the problem. Instead, he gave her a tight smile. "I'll think about it," he said, and shut the door. Linda clearly didn't like that. That evening, as Julian sat on the porch with a beer in hand, he saw her again, this time at the edge of his driveway, talking to a man in a polo shirt and khakis. She gestured toward Julian's house, speaking in hushed tones. The man nodded and scribbled something on a notepad. Julian didn't need to ask what was going on. Linda wasn't just trying to rattle him anymore. She was laying the groundwork to push him out. But if she thought that would work, she didn't know who she was dealing with. The next morning, Julian received an email from the HOA. Subject: Notice of Violation. The complaint? His porch furniture, 2 wicker chairs and a glass-top table, did not meet neighborhood aesthetic standards. Julian leaned back, expression unreadable. He'd walked this neighborhood countless times. At least a dozen homes had similar or even more questionable setups. One house even had plastic lawn chairs bleached from years in the sun. And yet, somehow, his porch was the issue. He ignored the notice. The next day, another email arrived. Subject: Second notice, lawn maintenance violation. Julian frowned. He had mowed, edged, and watered just the day before. The hedges were trimmed, the flower beds neat. He had even raked the leaves, though it was early fall. He knew what this was now. It wasn't enforcement, it was harassment. And Linda Carr had just made her final mistake. Julian opened his laptop and forwarded the latest violation to his attorney, Sam Delgado, with a short message: time to push back. Then he opened a folder he'd started weeks ago, full of photos, timestamps, and documentation of inconsistent rule enforcement throughout Maple Glen Heights. Linda had tried to bury him in paper. Now he was going to drown her in proof. Some people think they hold power because they write the rules. Julian Ross was about to remind them that real power comes from knowing how to challenge them. And this fight? It had only just begun. It started with a complaint that his grass was slightly overgrown. The letter warned that fines could be issued if the issue wasn't corrected. Julian Ross already knew what was happening. Linda Carr, president of the Maple Glen Heights HOA, wasn't maintaining order. She was building a paper trail. She was stacking minor violations to gather leverage, hoping to escalate him into a problem she could get rid of. So he decided to play her game. That evening, Julian took a slow walk through the neighborhood. He noted every actual violation he saw: overgrown lawns, cracked shutters, faded house numbers, trash bins still sitting by the curb from the day before. He snapped time-stamped photos and documented them all. Then he submitted his own formal complaint, organized, annotated, and impossible to ignore. Less than 24 hours later, Linda returned, but this time she wasn't alone. She stood at the edge of Julian's driveway, arms folded tightly across her chest. Beside her stood a tall, older man with salt and pepper hair, glasses, and a clipboard in hand. Julian recognized him from the HOA website. Douglas Tate, vice president of the board. Linda's face was taut, the usual mask of politeness pulled tighter than ever. "Mr. Ross," she greeted, voice clipped, "we received your list of complaints." Julian crossed his arms. "Good. Then you know I'm not the only one being held to a ridiculous standard." Douglas cleared his throat, glancing awkwardly at Linda before speaking. "We appreciate your observations. However, the HOA board determines which issues warrant formal action. Not every minor infraction justifies a notice." Julian chuckled dryly. "So mine do, but no one else's?" Linda didn't answer. Instead, she handed him a new notice, this one thicker than usual. "This is your final warning before fines are issued," she said. "Your porch furniture must be replaced, and your lawn must remain within regulation length at all times." Julian unfolded the paper, then looked up at her. "This isn't about chairs or hedges, this is about control." He let the silence stretch, then spoke calmly. "I've read the HOA bylaws. Nowhere does it say I have to replace furniture that's in perfect condition." Linda's shoulders stiffened. "It's a matter of neighborhood uniformity." Julian raised an eyebrow. "So now you enforce rules that don't actually exist?" Douglas shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the paper. For the first time, Julian saw something new: doubt. He leaned in. "Let me ask you something. If I were someone else, say one of my neighbors, would we even be having this conversation?" Linda's nostrils flared. Douglas opened his mouth, hesitated, and closed it again. Julian nodded. "That's what I thought." Linda inhaled sharply. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA has the authority to take further action." Julian met her gaze, steady and direct. "Then do what you have to do." Linda turned sharply and walked away, heels clicking across the pavement. Douglas lingered a second longer, then followed. Julian watched them go, the letter still in his hand. He had called her bluff, but he knew Linda Carr wasn't the type to let things go. He was right. The next morning, Julian found a thick envelope in his mailbox. No HOA logo this time. This one came from a law firm. Inside was an official complaint filed with the Boulder County Housing Authority. Linda had escalated the game, accusing him of being a fraudulent occupant. Julian's pulse stayed steady, but his fingers tightened around the paper. He read through the claims. Flimsy at best. Failure to provide ownership documentation, suspicions of unauthorized renting, vague statements that several neighbors had expressed concern. No names, no evidence, just a collection of innuendos dressed up in legal formatting. For a moment, Julian considered ignoring it. The accusations wouldn't stand. But then it hit him. This wasn't about winning. It was about wearing him down. Linda wanted him buried in paperwork and legal headaches. She wanted to frustrate him, drain him, make him walk away. She was counting on him folding under pressure. But what she didn't realize was that she had just played directly into his hands. That evening, Julian made a phone call. "Hey, Sam," he said as the line picked up, "I need a favor." Sam Delgado, his longtime real estate attorney, had helped Julian navigate high-stakes corporate contracts for years. The man was sharp, unflinching, and he hated bullies. "Tell me everything," Sam said. Julian smiled. "You're gonna love this." Together, they began building a case. Every violation, every ignored complaint, every selective enforcement tactic. Julian already had the evidence. All he needed now was to use it. Some people believe power comes from paperwork. Julian Ross knew better. True power comes from preparation and timing.
and Linda Carr was about to find out just how prepared he was. Delgado had been Julian Ross's real estate attorney for years, sharp, unshakable, and twice as relentless as Linda Carr could ever hope to be. By the next morning, Julian had everything he needed. But he wasn't just preparing a defense. He was flipping the situation on its head. 3 days later, the Maple Glen Heights HOA emergency board meeting was packed. Folding chairs lined the community clubhouse walls. Conversations buzzed low across the room. Everyone had heard the rumors. They were waiting for a showdown. Linda Carr sat at the head of the long table, her expression carefully neutral. Flanked by board members, some glanced around uncomfortably, others avoided eye contact entirely. Linda cleared her throat, lifting a printed document. "We are here to address the ongoing issue regarding Mr. Ross's residence. Given the numerous violations and community concerns, I'd like to speak," Julian interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Linda's lips thinned. "You'll have a chance to respond after." "No," Julian said, placing a stack of papers on the table. "I'm speaking now." A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience. Linda hesitated, then gestured stiffly for him to proceed. Julian stood, holding up the first document. "This," he said, voice steady, "is the deed to my home. Filed, recorded, indisputable." A few board members glanced at each other. Heads turned. He placed the deed on the table, then picked up another paper. "This is the purchase agreement for another property in the neighborhood, 14 Ridgepine Lane." Linda's expression remained still, but Julian saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "And this," he added, unfolding a third document, "is the deed for 16 Ridgepine Lane." Linda's house. A stunned silence filled the room. Julian didn't sit. He let the weight of the moment linger. The woman who had tried to have him removed was now learning that her own home belonged to him, and she hadn't even known. Linda's mouth opened, but no words came. "How?" she finally managed, her voice tight. Julian folded his arms. "You might want to check HOA records. The foreclosure you ignored? The sale last month? I was the buyer." Gasps echoed through the room. Linda's hands clenched around her papers. Her veneer of control cracked, her face paling. Julian tilted his head. "So tell me, Linda, who's the real trespasser now?" The room shifted. Where before the crowd had watched in silence, now the tension snapped. Whispers turned into murmurs. Discomfort spread among the board. Julian wasn't done. He picked up another page from his folder. "Let's talk about that legal complaint you filed, accusing me of being an illegal occupant." Linda's head jerked up. "Excuse me?" "You submitted a claim that I had no right to live in my home," Julian said, tapping the paper. "Fraudulent, baseless, and personal." He looked directly at her. "Would you care to explain why?" Her fingers twitched. She sat straighter. "As I stated in my report, several residents expressed concern." "Who?" Julian asked. "I'm not at liberty to disclose names." "That's interesting," Julian said, raising an eyebrow, "because I spoke with multiple neighbors this week. No one recalls making a complaint. Not one." A wave of shifting bodies swept through the audience. Some looked down. Others glanced uneasily at Linda. Julian pressed on. "You accused me of violating HOA policies. Meanwhile, you've ignored obvious violations all around the neighborhood." He lifted a stack of printed emails. "I reported cracked shutters, overgrown yards, trash bins left out for days. Not a single violation notice was issued. Not one." He turned to the board. "Tell me, do these rules only apply when Linda feels like enforcing them?" Douglas Tate, the vice president, adjusted his glasses. "I think we should take a moment to—" "No," Julian said, voice sharp now, "because this isn't about HOA rules. It never was." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but Julian didn't give her the chance. "This was about you deciding who you wanted in this community and who you didn't. That's abuse of power. That's harassment. And if you think I'm the only one who noticed, think again." He gestured to the crowd. "Look around.
People are tired of being quiet.
Eleanor Ridgway stood. He's telling the truth, and we all let this go on too long. Harold Brennan followed. We watched it happen and said nothing. No more. Julian nodded once. I don't need an apology. I just want fairness and transparency. Douglas cleared his throat. We will now vote on a motion to remove Linda Carr as HOA president pending investigation. Hands went up, all around the table, all around the room. Linda stared at the board, stunned, then lowered her eyes. Douglas spoke clearly. The motion passes. Julian sat down, silent now. He didn't need to say anything more. He had already won. It never was about enforcing rules. It was about Linda Carr deciding who she thought belonged in Maple Glen Heights. A sharp murmur rippled through the room as Julian Ross's words hung in the air. For the first time, Linda's carefully composed facade faltered. Panic flashed across her face. Julian wasn't just exposing her. He was forcing the entire neighborhood to see the truth of what had been happening right in front of them. Linda let out a shaky breath. I was simply trying to get him to leave, she started, her voice cracking. Julian finished her sentence for her. Yeah, I got that. Silence filled the room. Then a voice from the back broke through. This is a disgrace, an older man muttered. Julian turned to see Mr. Holloway, one of the longest-standing residents of the neighborhood, shaking his head. You really tried to evict the man who owns your house? A few scattered chuckles echoed through the room. The shift was happening. Julian wasn't done yet. He placed his final document on the table. And one more thing, Linda. Her eyes flickered nervously. Julian's gaze never wavered. You're behind on your HOA fees, he said, his voice calm and steady. Linda's head snapped up. That's a lie, she snapped. Julian tapped the paper he held in his hand. I bought your house at auction last month, Linda, and that includes the debt attached to it. You owe the HOA over $3,000 in unpaid fines and fees. A fresh wave of whispers swirled through the room. Julian could feel the tension rising. He leaned back, watching Linda's reaction. Stephen Reynolds, the vice president of the HOA, adjusted his glasses and frowned as he skimmed the document. Barbara, is this true? Linda's lips parted, but no sound came out. She had buried herself. Julian exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. He had won. But he knew Linda wouldn't go down quietly. She clenched her jaw, desperately scrambling for a way out. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, shoving her papers into a folder. We will revisit this matter at a later date. With that, she stood up, marched toward the exit, and her heels clicked loudly on the floor. But this time, no one followed her. The room was thick with silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The board members shifted uncomfortably, as though they were finally realizing the mistake they had made by aligning themselves with Linda Carr. Julian stayed in his seat, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. Slowly, murmurs began to rise. Can you believe this? Someone whispered. She tried to evict the wrong guy. Another chuckled. She messed with the wrong person. Stephen Reynolds, still seated at the head of the table, cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, he began, adjusting his tie, I think it's safe to say this situation was mishandled. Mishandled? Julian let out a short laugh. That's one way to put it. Lisa Hendricks, a middle-aged woman who lived 3 houses down, turned to him. I don't know what to say, she admitted, shaking her head. I had no idea she was doing all this. Julian arched an eyebrow. Didn't you? Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. A few other neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The truth settled in. They had seen it all. They had watched as Linda issued violation after violation, singling Julian out while ignoring similar issues with other properties. Yet, until Linda embarrassed herself, no one had said a word. Guilt was settling in now,
But guilt wasn't an apology, and Julian wasn't interested in empty words. He turned to Stephen Reynolds. "Since we're still here, let's discuss some actual HOA violations." He picked up the list he had prepared, the same one Linda had ignored when he submitted it weeks ago. Broken fences, trash bins left out for days, lawns that haven't been mowed in weeks. All of these violations are happening right now, but somehow I'm the only one receiving fines. Stephen glanced at the list, then at the other board members. A few looked visibly uncomfortable. They knew Julian was right. "We'll review these complaints properly," Stephen said, his voice shaky. Julian nodded slowly. "Good. And while you're at it, I'd like to file a formal complaint against Linda Carr for harassment, falsifying HOA complaints, and attempting to misuse her authority for personal grievances." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Do we have the authority to do that?" Stephen let out a slow breath. "The board can vote for removal if an HOA officer is found abusing their position." Julian leaned forward, then put it to a vote. Lisa hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I second it." One by one, the hands started going up around the room. The board members were no longer backing Linda. It was over. The motion passed. Linda Carr was removed as the HOA president. Julian leaned back in his chair. The weight that had been pressing on his shoulders for weeks was finally gone. One by one, hands began to rise in the room. Julian Ross watched as the neighbors who had once remained silent now voted to strip Linda Carr of her title as HOA president. It was ironic. If she had just left him alone, she would still be in charge. But her arrogance had been her downfall.
A few minutes later, Stephen Reynolds cleared his throat and read the final decision. By a majority vote, Linda Carr is officially removed as president of the Maple Glen Heights HOA, effective immediately. There it was, the final nail in the coffin. Julian stood and slipped his papers into his folder. "Well," he said, turning toward the door, "that was productive." A few chuckles broke the tension. As he stepped out of the room, Julian could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. They had all learned a lesson that night, but the person who needed it most was still in denial, because Linda Carr wasn't done yet. The morning after her public humiliation at the HOA meeting, Julian spotted Linda standing at the end of his driveway. She wasn't alone this time. Her husband, Richard, a man in his early 70s with a stiff posture and a permanent scowl, stood beside her. Julian stepped out onto his porch, arms crossed. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, his tone steady. Linda's voice was tight and controlled. "I want to discuss the sale of my home." Julian had expected this. After all, the thought of renting from him must have been unbearable for her. He gave a simple reply: "I'm not selling." Linda's jaw clenched, and her husband cleared his throat. "We're prepared to offer you a fair price." Julian leaned against the railing, eyes narrowing. "Define fair." Linda huffed, her patience clearly wearing thin. "The same amount you paid at auction." Julian let out a short laugh. "That's not how real estate works. You lost your house because of unpaid fees. I legally purchased it. If you want it back, you'll have to buy it at market value." Linda's hands balled into fists. "That's ridiculous. You're just trying to make a profit off me." Julian's expression hardened. "No, Linda. I'm treating you exactly how you treated me." Silence stretched between them. For weeks, Linda had weaponized the HOA rules and regulations against him, convinced she held all the power. Now, she was at someone else's mercy. Richard sighed. "How much?" Julian glanced toward the house. "Given the location, the current market, and your unpaid fees, $450,000. Linda's face twisted. "That's outrageous." Julian shrugged. "Then I guess you'll have to find somewhere else to live." For the first time, true panic flickered in Linda's eyes. This wasn't just about being removed from the HOA board anymore.
This was about losing the home she'd lived in for 3 decades. Richard sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "We'll consider it." Julian nodded. "Take your time." As they turned to leave, Linda hesitated. She looked back at him, her expression different now. Not quite remorseful, but the cold realization that she had never truly been in control. For weeks, she had focused on pushing him out, and now she was seeing the real danger. Her own actions had cost her everything. Julian let the moment sit before speaking. "Linda," he called, and she turned stiffly to face him. "Next time you judge someone before knowing them," he gestured toward her house, "remember where it got you." She didn't say a word. She simply turned and walked away. A month later, the for sale sign went up in front of 216 Oakwood Drive. Barbara had refused to buy the house back at Julian's price, and no bank would give her a loan for the amount she needed. She and Richard packed up and left in the middle of the night, moving to a smaller place across town. The neighborhood changed after that. Without Linda in charge, the HOA started working the way it was supposed to, addressing real issues instead of policing petty nonsense. The neighbors, some still avoiding eye contact out of embarrassment, began to make an effort. Slowly, the wall Linda had built began to crumble. One day, Lisa Hendricks, one of the few who had voted against Linda, walked up Julian's driveway with a plate of cookies. "I know it's late," she said, shifting awkwardly, "but welcome to the neighborhood." Julian smiled, accepting the plate. "Took you long enough." Lisa chuckled, a little sheepish. "Yeah, it did." Julian took a bite of a cookie. Sweet, a little stale, but better late than never. Some people spend their lives trying to control others, thinking their power comes from rules, status, and making others feel small. But real power comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more, because trust me, there's plenty more where this came from. The story of Julian Ross and Linda Carr teaches several important lessons about resilience, standing up for what's right, and the true meaning of power. First, it underscores the importance of not tolerating unfair treatment and standing up for oneself, even in the face of adversity. Julian's ability to gather evidence and challenge Linda's authority proves that knowledge and preparation are essential when fighting for justice. Another key takeaway is that power should not come from manipulating others, but from treating people fairly and with respect. Linda's misuse of her position as HOA president shows that authority can easily be abused when it's driven by ego rather than integrity. Julian's calm yet determined approach, on the other hand, illustrates that true power lies in fairness, transparency, and the courage to confront injustice. Finally, the story emphasizes the value of community. Julian's actions led to neighbors recognizing the need for change, ultimately uniting them for a fairer and more supportive environment. Life will always present challenges, but how we respond to them, standing up for what's right and treating others with respect, determines our true strength. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover our content. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next videos.